communities, along railways, and beyond. These pollutants affect the rail workers who breathe the diesel fumes day in and day out, taking home higher cancer risk and mortality. These pollutants affect the communities who live and work and play next to these railways, burdened with elevated risk of heart and lung disease. And those pollutants affect the ability of states and municipalities to uphold their responsibility to provide residents with healthy air. We have low emissions technology, and it's built by union workers. We even have zero emissions technology, and it's built by union workers. Railroads power America's past, but they can also supercharge our future. We have the technology, we have the workforce to make our railroads safe, efficient, and clean, moving goods and people where they need to go. I am a huge supporter of American railroads and rail workers. I have introduced the Brain Train Act to connect Massachusetts by rail. I have introduced the Freedom to Move Act to support fare-free transit to get Americans onto our trains and our buses. And I've supported increased funding for high-speed rail, and I've introduced the Safe Freight Act to support the safe operation of railways for rail crews and rail-side communities. I believe in American rail, and I believe in the workers that build and operate it. Rail can again become a beacon of American ingenuity, American innovation, and capability, uplifting the talents and industriousness of the hardworking people who build these next-generation locomotives. Today, we will learn about how our outdated regulations have left our communities, our workers, and our rail industry vulnerable. By updating regulations to better reflect the harms of air pollution and technological advances in locomotives, we can get back on track. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses about how we can continue to move forward to clean trains, healthy communities, and a strong union workforce. Before we hear from our witnesses, however, let me turn to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Senator Ricketts.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Markey, for initiating this important hearing. And I like how you worked in the railroading terms into your opening statement there. That was good. I'm going to have to talk to my team about that when we have those opportunities. Thank you as well to our witnesses who are here with us today to talk about these important issues. This hearing serves as an incredible opportunity to share the investments and innovations that are being made in our entire rail system. Nebraska has a long history of railroading, and much of our development is intertwined with rail expansion in the West. Today, the rail industry employs over 8,000 Nebraskans. Rail ships grain, biofuels, and feed ingredients out of Nebraska while also importing in coal, fertilizer, and steel. What I'm getting at here is that rail volume is critically important to the economy of Nebraska. A point that is likely to be reiterated throughout this hearing: U.S. freight railroads can move 1 ton of freight more than 500 miles or nearly 500 miles on a single gallon of fuel. Now, to put in that perspective, that is able to cross the entire state of Nebraska and from Iowa to Colorado. So that's a pretty incredible efficiency to be able to move a ton of freight across the entire state of Nebraska with 1 gallon of fuel. Nationally, rail makes up about 28% of the freight movement by ton miles, but railroads only account for 1.7% of the total U.S. transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions. To give you another perspective, it would have taken almost 2 million additional trucks to handle the 34.5 million tons of freight that originated by rail in Nebraska in 2021 alone. America's railroads have already taken steps to further reduce emissions, including increasing the uses of biodiesel and renewable diesel. In some cases, renewable diesel and biodiesel can reduce carbon emissions by 25%. Utilizing more renewable diesel and biodiesel is a win-win scenario. Renewable diesel and biodiesel are produced from agricultural byproducts, wastes, and residues, such as soybeans, canola, and corn oils, animal fats, and used cooking oils. Creating value through byproducts sustains value for farmers across the country, decreases emissions, and supports renewable refitting jobs across, refining jobs across rural America. Renewable fuels are the here and now solution to maintain rail efficiency while decreasing emissions. There are ongoing efforts to push towards the electrification of our entire rail system. However, there are also many concerns with this approach. As you all know, the freight rail industry is an interconnected system of the 7 Class I railroads and hundreds of short-line railroads that own and maintain over 180,000 route miles of track throughout North America. At any given moment, 5 to 10% of the line haul locomotives being operated by the 7 Class I railroads are actually owned or leased by another railroad. As Class I railroads utilize one another's tracks and cars, this system is wholly reliant on the interoperability of technology. The deployment of unique locomotive technology would create captive fleets that serve small geographic regions, harming the efficiency of railroad operations and disrupting entire supply chains. Electrification of our nation's freight rail network would also require building and maintaining a reliable high-voltage catenary system. This kind of system would require infrastructure through cities, deserts, plains, rivers, rail tunnels, and bridges. Estimates put the cost of electrification at millions of dollars per railroad track mile. I am supportive of and excited for the industry to lead innovation in this space. North Platte is the home to the Bailey Yard, the world's largest classification yard. The Bailey Yard is responsible for sorting and building trains covering 2,850 acres and including more than 300 track miles. The Bailey Yard will actually be the home to 4 battery electric locomotives in the coming years, where the feasibility, safety, and reliability will be put to the test through Nebraska's hot summers and cold winters. This kind of industry lead innovation will ensure that our rail industry can make decisions that best support their workers, customers, and the supply chain as a whole. State and federal regulations cannot put the cart in front of the horse when it comes to reliability and safety. It is important our railroads maintain their interoperability, efficiency, reliability, and safety. Again, I look forward to hearing our witnesses' testimony and finding ways we can work together. And I also have an introduction from Mr. Jeffries, unless you're going to interview him, in which case then I will defer.
We're going to introduce all the witnesses and then hear their testimony in order, but you should, I think,
I'm on a roll.
At this time, introduce Mr. Jeffries.
Okay, very good. All right, so Mr. Jeffries, thank you for joining us. Mr. Jeffries serves as the President and CEO of the Association of American Railroads, where he advocates for and works with member railroads to ensure the continued viability of America's railroad industry. Prior to this role, Mr. Jeffries was the Senior Vice President of the AAR's Governmental Affairs, where he led the development and promotion and implementation of legislative priorities for the AAR. Before joining the AAR, Mr. Jeffries worked within government for more than a decade, including as a senior policy advisor to the chairman of the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. In this role, he provided policy guidance on a host of transportation issues, including railroad economic regulation and rail safety and passenger rail. Mr. Jeffries began his career in government serving as the senior advisor to the mayor of Lexington, Kentucky, before transitioning to the federal government. Prior to serving in the United States Senate, he worked for the U.S. Department of Transportation, Office of the Inspector General, and the U.S. Government Accountability Office. So again, thank you, Mr. Jeffries, for being here, and I look forward to having you answer our questions.
Beautiful, thank you. Now, let me continue by also introducing Carl Rosen. Mr. Rosen is the General President of the United Electrical Radio and Machine Workers of America. UE represents 35,000 workers across America, including railway crew drivers and machinists that build next-generation clean locomotives. Mr. Rosen has been a member of UE since 1984, when he joined as a rank-and-file member. And we will also hear from Ms. Yvette Torres. Ms. Torres will be joining us virtually. She is the lead community researcher at the People's Collective for Environmental Justice. Ms. Torres has been raised in freight communities her entire life. She is an expert on the environmental impacts of freight movement on Southern California communities. Finally, we will hear from Mr. Ian Jeffries, which you just have heard introduced by Senator Ricketts. So with the conclusion of the introductions, Mr. Rosen, you're up.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having this important hearing today. Our union represents thousands of workers in the rail industry, both those who manufacture locomotives and parts and rail crew drivers who work in rail yards across the country. We are unequivocally in favor of stricter emission standards for rail. Stricter standards will be good for workers and good for the economy and can be met using existing technology. In 1998, the Environmental Protection Agency instituted a tier-based system for regulating the emissions of locomotives. Modern Tier 4 locomotives have been in production since 2014 and became the standard for all newly built locomotives in 2015. They are estimated to emit 90% less particulate matter and 80% less nitrous oxide than Tier 2 locomotives, those built before 2012. When the EPA issued the Tier 4 standard, it estimated that by 2023, over 30% of the locomotives on the rails would be Tier 4. However, the railroads have been slow to upgrade to this cleaner and greener technology. As of 2021, the most recent data for which Bureau of Transportation Statistics data is available, less than 10% of the Class 1 railroad locomotive fleet was Tier 4, while over 3/4 was still Tier 2 or lower. Without action by our government officials, the railroads will keep those dirty locomotives running for years, if not decades to come. Rail yards are well known as hotspots for pollution, and in urban areas they are often located in low-income communities of color. Neighborhoods surrounding high-traffic yards in California have a significantly elevated rate of cancer. When wind carries air from a yard into a residential area, airborne black carbon spikes to twice the normal level for an urban area. Children living near rail yards have twice the incidence of asthma of those living at least 4 miles away. Hundreds of UE members work in these unhealthy environments on a daily basis. Many of them live there as well. It is unconscionable that we let this go on when existing technology can mitigate the issue, and now commercially viable technologies like battery locomotives can all but eliminate it. Setting stricter emission standards for locomotives is not only the right thing to do for workers and communities around the railroads, it will also stimulate American manufacturing, as new requirements for railroads to fully modernize their fleet will spur demand. Essentially, all manufacturing of locomotives for the U.S. market takes place domestically, and much of it is union, with family-supporting wages and benefits, such as at the UE-represented plant in Erie, Pennsylvania. A recent report by the University of Massachusetts Amherst shows that if the Erie plant were to be utilized to its full capacity building clean locomotives, it would create thousands of quality, family-supporting jobs in a Rust Belt city that has been hit by both deindustrialization and job loss associated with our transition away from fossil fuels. The existing regulations are outdated and full of loopholes, and there is no mechanism to enforce the adoption of new green technologies. We need stricter enforceable standards. We need to allow states to take the lead, as California is attempting to do, in protecting the health and welfare of its residents. But we also need action on the federal level to ensure that the benefits of new standards are shared across our nation. Tier 4 locomotives have been in production for almost a decade. Zero-emissions battery-operated locomotives have been in use for years in rail yards. These are proven technologies. Their adoption is not a matter of technological feasibility, but of priorities. What is more important for our country? Clean air, addressing the climate crisis, and good jobs, or corporate profits, executive bonuses, and payments to Wall Street? The Class 1 railroads, which own 90% of the locomotives on the rails, are enormously profitable. However, we need to look no further than the disaster in East Palestine to see an example of how they prioritize profits over the public good. The bottom line is that they will not make this investment in our shared future unless our country requires them to. Setting stricter emission standards for the rail industry, requiring that they quickly upgrade their cross-country fleets to Tier 4 and use zero-emission locomotives in rail yards is the right thing for workers, the right thing for the planet, the right thing for working-class communities and communities of color, and the right thing for building greener, cleaner manufacturing in the U.S. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosen. And Ms. Torres, if you are ready, we can proceed with your testimony at this time.
Perfect. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you, Chair Markey, Ranking Member Ricketts, and the Clean Air, Climate, and Nuclear Safety Subcommittee of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee for inviting People's Collective for Environmental Justice to testify today. My name is Yvette Torres. I am the lead community researcher at the People's Collective for Environmental Justice in San Bernardino, California, and a PhD student in environmental engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. PC4EJ is a community-based environmental justice organization in the Inland Empire in Southern California. We fight against pollution and environmental racism caused by the freight and logistics industry. I am a member of the Moving Forward Network. MFN is a network of over 50 member organizations led by environmental justice communities representing over 2 million members, working to eliminate the deadly public health and environmental impacts caused by the freight transportation system. I want to thank the members of MFN who are here today and those who share their stories in my written testimony. I want to honor those who are not able to be here because of their health and those in the fight who have left us too soon because the regulators and rail industry fail to protect our communities from environmental burdens those same diesel-fueled industries caused. I was raised in freight communities my whole life. The Inland Empire is made up of San Bernardino and Riverside counties. We have desert, forests, and beautiful mountain landscapes. Picturesque hills surround our communities. Our elected say these same hills and mountain ranges trap the LA smog and cause the Inland Empire to have the worst ozone pollution in the nation. What our elected officials fail to see, and what the community has been pleading for years, is that the logistics and freight industry is the real reason our communities suffer from the worst air quality in the nation. Freight communities are hubs for the logistics industry. We see 40,000 diesel trucks come in and out of our neighborhoods every single day, and thousands of diesel trains that are miles long carrying tens of thousands of heavy containers coming into rail yards near our homes. Cargo air freight is also presently expanding. All these cumulative impacts are slowly killing my community and many others across the nation. The whole freight system is interconnected. It's poisoning us left and right. The California Air Resources Board ran a rail health impact study with community advocates and found that anyone living close to a rail yard, rail line, or port is most likely to have a lower lifespan due to risk of cancer, dubbing these communities, our communities, cancer clusters. I worked with community members who live by the San Bernardino Intermodal Facility to monitor both indoor and outdoor air quality. Community collected data that revealed inside their homes where they should feel comfortable and safe, where levels of particulate matter were 10 times more higher than the EPA standard. Community having to monitor the pollution is not unique to San Bernardino. MFN members across the nation are collecting their own data. This is because the railroads refuse to share any data with us. It is impossible to know when locomotives will idle for more than 30 minutes. When locomotives idle, they create a safety hazards. Communities like Colton, California are locked in, trapped by rail lines and truck traffic. Idling trains prevent emergency vehicles from being able to get to the hospital. We have also seen children jumping over trains to get to school. Over 13 million of us in the United States live and work near rail yards, rail lines, and ports. That's 13 million people who are most likely to be Black and Brown communities dealing with these realities day to day. But the last time EPA updated its emission standards was 15 years ago. We continue to suffer. There is no reason why our communities must suffer. The technology is here for locomotives and rail yard machinery to switch to zero emissions. 1/3 of the world's rail lines are electrified. Electric rails have been used for hundreds of years and transports the heaviest freight cargo. We should use technology like overhead catenary in the United States. Yet we have outdated diesel locomotives still operating today that are older than many of us in this room. Our goal is not to stop freight as we know it. The goods movement is an essential part of our country's lifeline. We want to transition our communities to safer, zero-emission technology. Many of us are products of the freight industry. I want to ensure we create more employment and investment opportunities in my community. That should not mean it should cost our lives. We can create opportunities while prioritizing community health and safety. EPA must adopt a zero-emissions locomotive standard.
So Thank you so much for your testimony. And now, having already been introduced, we welcome you, Mr. Jeffries. Whenever you feel comfortable, please begin.
Chair Markey, Ranking Member Ricketts, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about the freight rail industry's environmental profile and how we can work together to drive down transportation-related emissions. You've heard the stat today. A Class 1 railroad, on average, moves 1 ton of freight about 500 miles on a single gallon of fuel. And to use a different city pairing, that's further than the distance from Boston to Washington, D.C., using I-95. Railroads do this on infrastructure they own and they maintain, spending some $25 billion of their own money per year on the network. And pick your stat. The numbers, recognized by the White House's decarbonization blueprint, speak for themselves. While transportation is the largest source of U.S. emissions, rail, which moves approximately 40% of long-distance freight, is less than 2% of those total emissions. Rail today is 3 to 4 more times fuel efficient than trucks. And the possibilities are exciting as well. If just 10% of the freight that currently moves across the nation's highways moved by rail instead, annual emissions would fall by roughly 20 million tons, equivalent to taking 4.1 million cars off the highways every single year. None of this is by accident. It is a result of innovation, vigorous spending, and an understanding of the societal and economic benefits of continued environmental progress. Over the last 20 years, railroads consumed 11.8 billion fewer gallons of fuel and emitted 133 million fewer tons of carbon dioxide than they would have if they had not improved their efficiency. These gains emanate from buying or retrofitting better locomotives, incorporating anti-idling technologies, fine-tuning fuel management systems, and increasing the use of low-carbon fuels. Simply getting trucks in and out of yards quicker through technological innovation has made a market impact as well. The result, a strong foundation for the future. The next wave of progress on the main line and in yards is in sight as railroads are using more zero-emissions cranes, purchasing electric switcher locomotives for yard use, and testing battery and hydrogen-powered locomotives in revenue service. While the latter technologies are in pre-commercial stage, observers are justifiably encouraged. Yet progress does not stop, especially in driving further gains for particulate and overall emissions. We understand the urgency, including for fence line communities closest to rail operations. Progress will be best realized through practical policies grounded in data, and collaboration is a necessity. Some policies are easy wins, and we just saw that this morning in this committee. We encourage Congress to reauthorize and continue the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, and to support relevant grant and loan programs, particularly those most critical to short lines to help modernize their equipment. We also encourage Congress to support mode neutrality and sustainable fuel programs and to ensure research in this area considers the broadest possible base of feedstocks and resources. Other measures, however, are bigger lifts, namely the need to reestablish a user-pay system in transportation in a way that removes market distortions and uncompetitive subsidies for competing freight modes with higher emissions. We are encouraged to see the chair of this committee's call this week for DOT to make progress on a national vehicle miles traveled pilot program. And most of all, we must be pragmatic. On the contrary, proposed mandates like what we've seen in California, which would force the adoption of technology that is not commercially viable at odds with federal law, does not add up. While regulators in that state may think they're expediting decarbonization, in fact, they are diverting resources that could be used in accomplishing shared goals. The impact on small business alone with this proposed rule would be staggering, with 25% of short lines in the state of California expected to go out of business. The result of that, additional trucks on the highway, and not something that I think is the goal of CARB. Much of the same can be said about the widespread Canton area electrification ideas. This notion is simply unrealistic on a 142,000-mile network operating 24/7 in all climates across tunnels and bridges in all topographies. However, expressing concern is not obstinance. It reflects reality. And we cannot ignore the industry's measurable actions today and to date and let the hope of perfection stand in the way of continued meaningful progress made together. We are proud of our progress in this area and will continue to drive down emissions. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions today.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffries. Now we'll turn to questions from the panel. Let me begin by recognizing myself. The Environment Protection Agency hasn't updated its locomotive standards in 15 years. A lot has happened in 15 years. The science connecting air pollution and health impacts is stronger. And our clean technologies are much cheaper and better. During that same period, the EPA strengthened or proposed to strengthen emission standards for trucks and cars at least 5 separate times. We are taking action on emissions across the transportation sector, and our workers and companies are on the road to success, but our railroads have been left to fall behind. In 2008, the EPA set longer-term standards, known as Tier 4 standards, for newly built locomotives that reflected the advanced state of high-efficiency technologies in 2008. It also tightened standards for existing locomotives when they're remanufactured to varying degrees. But those standards made key assumptions that railroad operators would continue business as usual rather than pumping the brakes on innovation. Ms. Torres, do the locomotive emissions standards established in 2008 meet the needs of communities today?
No, unfortunately not. Tier 4 is still diesel fueled. Our communities have been suffering and continue to suffer. We know that technology is here and it's feasible, economically feasible, to go completely zero emissions. We need standards that are higher and better than the 2008 standards. Although it was adopted 15 years ago, and I know others may say that is something that could have helped us then, technology has moved and will continue to move towards zero emissions to make it feasible. So we need something that is not diesel fueled for tiers.
Okay, so Mr. Rosen, can you describe what a Tier 4 locomotive is, just so everyone can understand who's watching this across the country? Sure. Can you turn on your microphone?
The Tier 4 locomotive became the standard for all new locomotives in 2014. It reduced particulate matter by 70%. It reduced nitrogen oxide by 76%. It is a very substantial step up on any of the other diesel locomotives that are out there. I would agree with Ms. Torres that we have the ability to also be moving towards zero emission, but there's an awful lot of very old locomotives on the rails right now that could be quickly replaced in terms of the cross-country piece by Tier 4 while we get zero emissions over the coming period to cover that also eventually. But certainly in urban areas, there's no reason we shouldn't be using the zero emission locomotives right now. And I'll also point out they meet higher crash standards too. There were better crash standards put into place in 2009. And by continuing to have the overwhelming majority of locomotives out there being older locomotives, means that there's continued danger both to the communities where crashes might take place, as well as, of course, to the workers.
So just expand, what zero emissions options are available to, for the railway industry to adopt for locomotives?
Sure. Right now, the company where we represent workers has developed what they call the FLX locomotive, which is a battery locomotive, which can operate independently, and there's other companies that have battery locomotives which can certainly operate very well in rail yards where they can be recharged there. They can also operate well going cross-country in what they call a consist, which is basically in tandem with a diesel locomotive, ideally a Tier 4 locomotive, and you can really bring the emissions down farther. And then when you get into the cities, shut off the diesel altogether and run off of just the battery locomotive at that point.
So let me ask this, in terms of these low emission and zero emission trains, are they commercially available right now?
They are, and in
railways
fact,
to purchase?
Orders have been taken for these battery locomotives, and in addition, they've run good tests with them in California. There was a famous example of that being done within the last couple of years to show how much better off they are. And then in addition, There are electric locomotives that are in use in a number of places in this country and very heavily overseas, and those are all available too.
Okay, so where are these low-emission and zero-emission trains manufactured in our country that are available right now? Where are they made?
There are multiple locations, but the biggest source for, and especially for these battery locomotives, would be the large facility in Erie, Pennsylvania.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you, sir. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jeffries, some have accused the railroads of having opposing methods to reduce emissions. Can you speak about the industry's efforts to reduce emissions within their existing fleet of locomotives? And then are there federal programs that you support to help with these efforts?
Sure, thank you, Senator. Well, I think, you know, it's not a joke, but that you want to reduce emissions right now, take trucks off the highway and put them on the rail, and you reduce emissions by 3 to 4 times. And again, truckers are our biggest partners and our biggest competitors as well. So I say that with a smile on my face, but it's fact. Railroads, as we mentioned, 40% of long-haul freight, less than 2% of transportation-related emissions. And that's due to the investments we've made over the years. Certainly, there have been billions invested into modernizing or re-equipping locomotives. Some of the examples about next-gen locomotives were mentioned by my colleague as far as getting battery electric into revenue service, proof of concept, working on hydrogen-powered locomotives. In the yards, getting electric cranes, electric switcher locomotives, even, again, using technology to get the throughput faster in yards, because idling trucks, for example, are leading to additional emissions, additional release of particulate matter. Anti-idling technologies in locomotives and yards as well. So I would also add that as a transition, as we move into the next gen of locomotives and of power, increasing the use of biofuels, whether it's renewable diesel, whether it's other renewable fuels into the feedstocks of how we're powering our locomotives is absolutely key as well. So it's certainly a multi-pronged approach.
Great. And you know what? You just mentioned biofuels there. So according to a recent blueprint for transportation, decarbonization, biodiesel, and renewable diesel can play a key role in reducing rail emissions, especially in the near and medium terms. Can you discuss how the industry is utilizing these fuels, and are there things Congress can do to ensure that these fuels are in sufficient supply and cost competitive?
Sure. So increasing the percentage of biofuels in our overarching power structure, and whether that's, again, a mix of renewable diesel or biofuels, an 80-20 mixture there. What can Congress do? I think really hold a level playing field when it comes to how you approach sustainable fuel development, sustainable fuel subsidies, sustainable fuel feedstocks, so that all modes have an opportunity to increase deployment. So you want to raise availability, decrease the price, and that'll increase use overall across all modes.
Great. And then CARB has once again been working toward a significant regulation to impact the transportation sector. How would the regulation being considered by CARB impact the functioning of the national network?
Well, you hit the nail on the head when you said national network. And our network is over 140,000 miles. It operates in an interconnected nature. So locomotives, trains on the West Coast end up on the East Coast, and mixed and matched throughout the network. And so really, when you're looking at a proposed regulation of that magnitude, it has national impacts, national consequences on the ability of the network to operate. We don't operate just within the bounds of one state. That's why we have federal law that actually prohibits efforts along these lines when it comes to regulating new or retrofitted locomotives. And we think the appropriate place to have this discussion is at the federal government, and we're happy to play a productive role in that process.
Can you discuss what sort of impact this regulation would have on short line railroads?
Well, it would be nothing short of a death knell to about 25% of the short lines in California.
And why do you say that?
Because on average, estimates show that to comply with the regulation, about 40% of the average short line's revenue would be required and dedicated to complying here. And frankly, 25% of the short lines in that state that they can't function with that sort of cost structure. So what's the result? The result is that freight's going to get diverted onto the highways, increasing congestion with less efficient, more emissions transmitting modes of transportation. And so I think that's the opposite of the direction we want to go to. Again, this should be a collaborative effort focused on what the market can support when it comes to production and what our small businesses can afford when it comes to transitioning to a cleaner future.
Yeah. And are you familiar with what I mentioned in my opening remarks with regard to the Bailey Yard in North Platte and their battery electric locomotives? Are you familiar with that Union Pacific project by chance?
Yes.
So how long do you think it would take then to get those implemented and be able to look at the feasibility with regard to those and what they would be able to do going forward?
Well, certainly we're already deploying battery electric in, as I said, in yards, and there have been orders made by the railroads. I know one railroad is only getting half as many as they've ordered because of production capability and availability when it comes to the batteries required. So there's a bit of a long lead time there. But what we're really looking at is a generational fleet overturning over a significant amount of time. These are long life assets, and we want to make sure we can continue to move America's freight. We all want to do a job in a way that reduces emissions and continually reduces our environmental impact. But it's got to be done in a way that can allow us to continue to operate, serve our customers, serve our communities, and that the production market can actually handle.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Jeffries.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So Chair will recognize himself again. I am a technological optimist. It was the hydroelectric mills that brought my grandfather to Lawrence, Massachusetts, to work in the mills of Lawrence during the Industrial Revolution. And today we have new advances in battery technologies that we now celebrate. The American story is one of technological ingenuity. We've heard from Mr. Rosen about advances in battery technology and catenary lines to power our railways. Our technological optimism and our well-trained union workers are our best source of clean and renewable energy. Combined with our existing technologies, we can protect community health and support American innovation. Ms. Torres, you painted this beautiful picture of a zero-emissions future for communities. How far away from that are we in terms of the actual technology?
The technology is here now. It is time to work with EPA, elected officials, the Class 1 rails, our workers, and our community members to get that transition moving into our communities that are most impacted. We had, as mentioned earlier, overhead catenary that has been used and can be used as a bridge as well to still continue the work and make it economically feasible. As we continue with technology to advance and specifically zero emission technology, we can continue to come back to assess the current technology available. But it is here now. It is economically feasible. Tarv mentioned around 25 billion of savings, and not to mention the health savings to get to that, right? There's a lot of unaccounted costs that are not talked about when we look at this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Rosen, my father was actually a local vice president in the UE. You know, obviously, I'm familiar with the work ethic. You know, people want to go to work, make good money, take care of their families. My father's son is a United States Senator, so thank you, UE, for helping to provide that funding. What kind of answer would you give to Mr. Jeffries saying, oh, we just can't afford to have railroads have to purchase these more fuel-efficient, you know, trains in our country? You know, your workers want to make these trains, but they're saying we can't afford to buy them. So what's your answer to them?
You know, the money is certainly there in the railroads. These are very profitable industries. They've returned a great return to their shareholders, to Wall Street, to the executives. And it's a question of priorities. And it's also a question of how they want to look at the costs and benefits too, because in the longer term, with the fuel savings that you'll see, with the greater durability actually of non-diesel locomotives, et cetera, it's an excellent long-term investment. The problem is they're operating according to the mandates of Wall Street, which are not so interested in what's going to happen in the long term, but what's going to happen in the next quarter. And that's why they really need to be given a directive at this point by the government. You have to do this if they want to remain in business. I mean, they've shirked their responsibility for the last 8 years. They should have had 30% at Tier 4 already, and it's less than 10%. That would have made a huge difference right now. And it would have also resulted in some of the, slightly better but not worst locomotives being moved down into the rail yards, where we have, I believe the figure in Ms. Torres's documents that were presented as part of her written testimony, something like 2/3 of the locomotives in the rail yards are Tier 0 or Tier 0 plus. I mean, these are 30, 40-year-old locomotives. It's just outrageous.
So you're saying that the railway industry just isn't investing in these clean technologies. The union workers are ready to construct the new locomotive engines that would go to low or zero emission standards. And the technology does exist, but the railways just refuse to do it. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. There's been deep reductions in the number of workers making locomotives in this country, not because they're being made overseas. They're not being made at all. The rail industry just stopped ordering new locomotives and are running the old ones to death, but it's also to the death of the American population.
Yeah, so that's what it sounds like to me. These numbers are the most recent that I have, but only 7% of Class 1 locomotives were Tier 4 locomotives in 2020. Old locomotives that emit 5 times as much dangerous pollution as the current top tier of locomotives make up nearly 1/4 of all Class 1 locomotives. That doesn't sound like investment to me. That sounds like inaction to me, Mr. Rosen.
Absolutely, and that's what our concern is, and I think that's why you're also hearing from Ms. Torres on behalf of the environmental justice communities too, that the time has run out for the rail industry to do this voluntarily on their own, driven by the market, whatever terminology they want to use. This is absolutely an area that's crying out for government intervention.
Okay, Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jeffries, it's just been described about the locomotives and the claim that the railroads are not replacing their engines. Do you have a knowledge of what would the estimate be of the average lifetime of a locomotive? I mean, how much do they cost and how long are they expected to last?
An average locomotive costs about $4 million and upwards of 40-year lifespan. If I could make one comment on the investment discussion that occurred. The rail industry I mentioned in my opening statement invests about $25 billion of its own dollars every year. And the result of that is the highest rated infrastructure of any type in this country as graded by the American Society of Civil Engineers. And again, that's privately owned, that's privately maintained. It's not federally owned, it's not nationalized, because take a look at that type of infrastructure. Take a look at the Northeast Corridor. It's about a $100 billion investment deficit. This industry invests almost 19 cents per revenue dollar. That's 6 times more than the average industry. And so I don't want to hear that this industry isn't investing. We can talk about the turnover of the locomotive fleet, and absolutely that's something we're interested in. That's why we have been out in revenue service when it comes to battery electric, when it comes to hydrogen. That's why we're deploying different types of power in our yards to reduce emissions. And it doesn't add up that the investment's not occurring there. And we're happy to have that discussion about a new federal standard, absolutely, but it needs to be done in an achievable manner.
And also one of the things that Mr. Rosen said was that at the time the new regulations came out in 2014, it was estimated, and I presume it was by the EPA, that 30% of the Class 1 railroads would have Tier 4 engines by 2023, which is just next year. Was the railroad industry consulted, do you know, as part of those estimates? I mean, I can tell you based on my experience with the EPA, they don't talk to industry when they make regulations, but I was not personally involved in any of this. Do you have any knowledge of this by chance?
I certainly can't speak to the level of consultation or engagement that occurred. I know that based on my experiences with some other estimates that have occurred with other agencies, what's said and what's real doesn't always add up. But again, you know, we're investing literally billions in either the modernization of locomotives, new types of locomotives, and any sort of mandate or forcing into purchasing Tier 4s right now. For those that want to get away from diesel, all that does is lock in diesel power for the next 4 decades. So we're focused on the beyond. I think that's one area that Mr. Rosen and I can agree on, is that we do need to continue development of battery electric and we would say other alternate sources of power. And we should all be working together toward that goal and figuring out the best way to get things into the marketplace at a faster clip.
Yeah, and if I could just add on, talking about biodiesel and renewable diesel, which also reduces emissions, as we talked about, the EPA set their goals in the RVOs, the renewable volume obligations for the oil industry, at below what the current industry is actually producing. So once again, the EPA not talking to industry. But let's talk a little bit about now the catenary system that was described before for the electrification of it. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, describe a little bit what would be some of the challenges to go to an electric system. Wouldn't you have to, again, build this through every one of those 144,000 miles you were talking about?
Absolutely you would, and you'd have to develop the power stations and power sources along those. Often, as you know, the great state of Nebraska, we operate across very rural areas where power sources aren't readily available. That's grid development that we would be responsible for. You're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, so you'd have to rework tunnels, rework bridges, thousands of bridges, never mind what needs to be done on the locomotives themselves. Certainly, it works well in urban areas up and down the Northeast corridor. Absolutely. You know, I take the train every time I go up to the Northeast. But across a 142,000-mile network, in a network that locomotives from one rail operate across another company's lines all the time, everything has to be interconnected, everything has to function seamlessly. That level of an endeavor, one, it's not realistic, and two, it doesn't make sense for the future.
And the estimate to do that per mile, do you know?
I think it's in the millions.
And do you know, has anybody actually put pencil to paper to do the calculation to say, hey, if we were going to electrify this entire system, how much power generation would we need and how long would it take to do it?
I would venture to guess that no one has contemplated that, and it's a leap of faith unlike any other.
And do you know how long, assuming we could meet the power generation standards, do you know how long it would take to actually do something like that if you were going to try and do it?
Decades.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Rosen, kind of the same question to you. Has anybody done the calculation to know how much power generation we would need if we were going to electrify the entire rail system?
There's actually somebody in this room who has done a lot of work on that from an organization called Solutionary Rail, who have some very creative ideas about how to do it. I will agree this would be a project for the entire nation that would probably take decades. It's probably the kind of investment that our country needs to do. Whether the individual railroads will be willing to do that left to their own, or whether it has to become something that the government has a direct role in, is another question. And it also doesn't require putting catenary on every single mile, because you can use the battery electric locomotives for some in-between sections. They can get well charged in the sections where you have the electric lines up, and then coast through the other areas on the battery electric, including places like tunnels, et cetera. And it does require probably rethinking the electrical grid. We need to do that anyway as a country. We are converting our entire power system in this country. We have to. This is not about, does it cost too much money or not? This is a question of, what's it going to cost the human race if we don't electrify everything?
Great. Well, I see I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. The Senator from California, Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In my limited time, we're going to try to get through a couple of important issues, beginning with Ms. Torres. I know you're joining virtually. I want to thank you for testifying on behalf of the communities who are on the front lines of California's air pollution crisis. I agree with how you described this, that rail pollution is a national issue with local impacts. So while many Americans love getting an untold number of products delivered to our doorstep, it does come at a significant cost to people who live near the ports and railroads that are the backbone, frankly, of America's goods movement infrastructure. Ms. Torres, your written testimony shares that despite the EPA's efforts 15 years ago to update locomotive regulations, there's somehow still locomotives in rail yards that are 60 to 70 years old. So my question is, can you help explain how it's possible that a locomotive can operate its entire service life without having to reduce emissions?
Yes. That loophole is that there wasn't a phase out of any older trains or older locomotives. A lot of that happens with the rebuilding. And so because it is refurbished, it does not have to meet the new emission standards of that current year. So if you're using older trains and you're just refurbishing them, the standards are still from the 1960s, 1920s. Therefore, allowing a loophole of the current standards from 2008 for Tier 4 to not have to be taken into consideration.
Great. That's very important for this committee to understand, and something that we should absolutely try to address. And I also have, Mr. Chair, questions about our low-carbon fuel standards. California's low-carbon fuel standard is helping advance a wide range of clean fuels, while at the same time keeping consumer costs down. California is proudly the 5th largest economy in the world, on our way to becoming the 4th largest economy in the world, and in so doing, proving that it's possible to both grow our economy and reduce emissions. They are not mutually exclusive. California's tech-neutral approach, greater long-term predictability, and cost containment mechanisms have provided both certainty and flexibility. Now, this program has been so successful that other jurisdictions are joining California, as we can see in the Pacific Coast Collaborative, a regional agreement between California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, to strategically align policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote clean energy. Mr. Jeffries, it's my understanding that the majority of the rail industry's use of low-carbon fuels, such as renewable diesel, is in California. So what role does California's low-carbon fuel standard play in driving the use of low-carbon fuels in the rail industry on the West Coast?
Well, certainly the use of low-carbon fuels, whether it's renewable diesel, whether it's biodiesel, is in heavy use in California. Of course, not exclusively in California, something we're proud of across the country and something we're working to do more of. I can tell you this, that we absolutely support a mechanism at the federal level that holds all modes equal when it comes to reducing the cost and increasing availability of low-carbon fuels, because we absolutely think there's a big role to play there as we transition into the true next-generation power sources.
So I think I just identified an area of agreement.
Absolutely.
If I heard you correctly.
That's why we're here.
So as we work to increase the use of low-carbon fuels across the rail industry, do you believe it would be helpful to have a national low-carbon fuel standard? And imagine you would agree, this would also reduce emissions in the rail industry if we applied it nationally.
Well, we certainly support programs that, again, reduce the cost of renewable fuels and increase the availability. We do think it is critical at the federal level that all modes be held equal, that we're not
That's called the
picking
federal
choosing.
standard.
As far as across different modes, that the promotion, the incentives, et cetera, that'll increase the use, that, again, every mode is held harmless, held equal, and so that all modes can take advantage of this, and that the availability is there at a price that incentivizes increased use. So I think we use different terms, but I think we're trying to get at the same end game.
I appreciate that. And again, with California's experience as the model, setting the standard, technology neutral, and you can achieve both the reduced emissions and economic growth, which I would imagine you would agree with that as well. And I emphasize this, Mr. Chair, because what I'm hearing is that thanks to California's leadership in advancing a low-carbon fuel standard, the rail industry in California is moving to lower their lower carbon fuels that result in these lower emissions. So the written testimony Mr. Jeffries provided says policymakers should avoid imposing prescriptive means for reducing emissions in the rail industry. But I think the lesson here is that thanks to California's standard, the rail industry can and will reduce emissions. But without California's standard, industry would just have kept doing what it's always done in the past. So it's not too far of a leap to suggest that the same can be accomplished nationally with tighter EPA emission standards. Without the new standards, industry will just continue to behave like the status quo. So based on this committee's previous hearings on the low carbon fuel standard and the testimony we've heard today, I see a clear need for a national low carbon fuel standard. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we can produce a bill in this committee to that effect, and also just the need for EPA to get moving on updated emissions standards. Last but not least, Mr. Chair, I know my time has expired. I want to thank you for Kike returning to the Dodgers.
And on top of that, you're welcome for having Mookie Betts already be there to greet him from Massachusetts. But we just hope it's the end of our generosity to LA. It's hard to bear sometimes watching those games. So we thank the senator from Los Angeles, and now Senator, congressional expert. It's an oxymoron. There really is no such thing. It's like jumbo shrimp, oxymoron. Salt Lake City nightlife, no such thing. But I'm now going to recognize a man who was elected to Congress 40 years ago, and he's taken the train every single day. So I give you an expert, Senator Copper, the chairman of the committee.
Thanks so much. I've shared this story with some of my colleagues before, but when my sister and I, we were born in West Virginia, coal mining town, Beckley. And even after we moved away, we'd go back in our summers and visit our grandparents, our cousins and all. And one of our grandparents, my dad's grandparents, lived along a railroad track. And we would almost faithfully every morning there, we were staying with those grandparents about 10 o'clock in the morning. A freight train would come through. And probably not even as far as from here to that wall back there. And my sister and I would stand at a fence that separated the rail track and my grandparents' house. And we would stand at that fence, and as the train got closer and closer, we would try to get the attention of the engineer by jumping up and down and pumping our arms so that he might blow his whistle and recognize that we were alive. And one particular day, this happened, and not only did he blow his whistle, but he stopped right in front of the house. I mean, like right in front of the house. Off the train comes my grandfather, our grandfather, opens the gate, takes us by the hand, both of us, puts us up on the train, and we take off. It seemed like for about 500 miles. It was about 50 feet, no, maybe 500 feet. And the train stops, and my grandfather helps us get off the train and says, run back to the house, don't tell your grandmother. We ran back to the house. Grandma, you'll never guess what Grandpa did. And she said, he didn't. He didn't do that. He'll go to jail. If he did it today, he would go to jail. And we might go with him. So anyway, my involvement with the train started at an early age, and my interest continues to this day when I rode down this morning on Amtrak to get here. But I want to thank our chairman for holding the hearing today. Rail continues to be a key component of our U.S. transportation infrastructure, is the most fuel-efficient mode of service land transportation that I think we have. I've used for years the figure it takes to ship by rail a ton of freight from Washington, D.C. to Boston, Massachusetts. It takes about a gallon of diesel fuel. That's pretty good, pretty economical. I'm told by the barge people that at least sending stuff on barges can be even more fuel efficient, and they probably have something to say there. But in everything we do, I think we ought to do better, try to do better at least. And the same is true for reducing emissions from all kinds of vehicles, including trains in our country. Rail yards in particular often have a much higher density of local emissions. Reducing emissions at yards seems like, I guess, like low-hanging fruit when it comes to improving public health and climate outcomes. I have a question from Ms. Torres that relates to this, and then maybe one for Mr. Rosen as well. But Ms. Torres, is she remote? Yes. So, Ms. Torres, where are you?
I'm here in San Bernardino, California.
You're in California?
San Bernardino, California, yes.
Good. Well, thanks for joining us. Could you briefly elaborate for us on the disproportionate health and economic burdens that are faced by communities near rail yards? And go ahead and try that, and then I have a second half. Go ahead.
Thank you for that question. Yes, for communities living by rail, kind of as you were growing up by a rail line. Thank you for sharing that story. There's at least more than 90% of diesel exhaust of what I talked about earlier, particulate matter, that are coming into our communities, not only from the direct rail line or rail yards, but there's what we like to call cumulative impacts as well. So when we talk about the locomotives that are coming and are idling for more than 30 minutes, that's 30 minutes of direct exposure of diesel particulate matter that community is suffering with. That is leading to cancer, health, cardiovascular. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just being summoned to come to another here. We have a simultaneously meeting, the Finance Committee is meeting right now. We're just having a live vote and a business meeting, and they need my presence to come and vote with respect to pharmacy benefit managers. And it's a big issue, and I got to go. I'm going to ask you to respond to the question for the record. Mr. Chairman, I have a couple of other questions for Mr. Rosen, and I apologize. I profusely apologize, but I've been here for a long time. I still haven't learned how to be in two places at once. So thank you all. This is a really important stuff. I'm grateful that you're holding this hearing, both of you.
Yep. He's not ubiquitous, but he is omniscient. Okay, so, you know, that we know. So now we'll go back to the non-expert part of the hearing, and Senator Sessions and I will continue. And I recognize Senator Ricketts for another round of questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairman Markey. Actually, one of the things I'd like to do is, for the record, submit this letter from the Deemster diesel folks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Great, thank you very much. And I'd actually like to talk a little bit more about my colleague from California was talking about with regard to the renewable fuels, and just hit upon again how I think this is an area of common agreement that using more renewables is something that will help us reduce emissions, whether we're talking about biodiesel or renewable diesel. And the failure of the EPA to actually establish those renewable volume obligations at a level that we actually are already producing in the industry today. And what that does is it discourages more investment. In Nebraska, we have a soybean crush plant that is being invested in Norfolk, another one in David City. So the industry was making those investments. And now I'm told with these renewable volume obligations that the EPA is failing to show that it even actually lives up to what we're doing already. We're going to see a curtailment of the types of investments like we see in Norfolk and David City. And so if we want to see more renewable diesel and more biodiesel, we're going to have the EPA collaborate on renewable volume obligations so the industry will continue to invest and be able to make sure that we have more available to be able to use, because I think that is one of the things, as the Senator was talking about, we do find agreement. We may not agree exactly on how to implement it, but we certainly agree that encouraging more renewable fuels is something that's going to be important. One of the things I'd like to hit upon, and Ms. Torres, I didn't get a chance to ask you, but if you knew, on that whole electrification, the catenary system, are you aware of anybody who has done some work on, some pencil to paper work on what it would take to be able to power that if we were going to go down that path?
For the United States, not the exact numbers, but we do have numbers that are showing that it would be transitional, very feasible. And that's in my written testimony.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Now, one of the things that I wanted to hit upon is when you're talking about your members considering the purchase of a new locomotive, Mr. Jeffries, Can you give us some insights on some of the specifications that they're considering when they think about, okay, it's time to buy a new locomotive? What's the process? What do they consider? How do they do that investment?
Well, first and foremost, demand. You got to have something to move with that locomotive. So the market's got to drive those investment decisions, and I'm certainly not going to represent myself as having any sort of authority or expertise on the individual investment decisions that each of the railroads makes. Obviously, that's their prerogative. But you need to look at one capability. Does the locomotive have the ability to haul heavy freight long distances? So what's the role of the locomotive? Is it to be used in yard? Is it to be used locally? Is it to be used out on the national network for long freight? Do you have the ability to charge it, to power it appropriately? And really, we're looking at 40-year assets. And so it's just like when we engage in infrastructure investment on the network. If you're taking a single track and you're double tracking that's an investment that has to be the return on that occurs over decades and decades and decades. And so these are very significant investments for very long periods of time. And as we sit here today, railroads are investing upwards of over $1 billion. I know of one railroad by retrofitting, modernizing 600 locomotives, many of which I believe are being done by the company that Mr. Rosen's union works at, and that's an over $1 billion endeavor. And that's going to result in lower emissions of all kinds.
So you mentioned, though, that somebody had ordered the battery electric locomotives and only was able to get half as many as they ordered. Can you talk more about what is the cause of why they could want to order battery electrics and not being able to get them delivered?
I think it was due to battery availability that one of the OEMs was running into challenges with. But again, that's kind of how the process works at the outset. But the encouraging thing is, I think we do see a future there. One of my railroads had a long-term project that had a battery electric working with diesel out in revenue service, a proof of concept. The results were favorable. And so the progress continues and the work continues. And so I think it's important that we keep an all-of-the-above strategy, whether it's renewable fuels, whether it's battery electric, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's alternate means, that allows us to continue to do R&D, to identify what the best long-term prospects are. And again, keeping in mind that it is an interconnected national network where everyone's system needs to be able to function with the others in a seamless manner.
Great. All right. Thank you, Mr. Jeffries.
you.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Senator. You know, when I was a boy, I mean, I still live in the very same place, but when I was a boy, one block from my house, to the left of our house, was the electric trolley that went into Boston from Malden all day, every day. We didn't have air conditioning, so especially in the summer, it was like the sounds of the nights, just hearing those trolleys go in and out. Electric trolleys, by the way. You know, we already invented the future and then tore it down and had diesel buses instead take people into Boston from Malden. And on 3 blocks the other side of my house were the railroad tracks for the freight and the commuter rail to go from Boston to Lawrence and beyond all day long, every single day. So the sound of trains on both sides of my house were pretty much the sounds of trains. At night, just so many nights I would just go to sleep listening to those trolley cars. So I think everyone has a train story in their life. It was a big part of my life, that's for sure. And the question really is, how quickly can we move to this new era? So I think what I heard was that the industry invests $23 billion a year in infrastructure. I think that's what I heard you say, Mr. Jeffries. And you're proud of that. So that would be, you know, $230 billion of investment over a 10-year period. And that the new locomotive engines cost $4 million, not billion, $4 million, out of $230 billion investment over a 10-year period. And that's investment that you're already making. So a reprioritization, you know, would clearly get a big payoff in terms of reduced emissions and kind of this transition to the new technology. So that's what's kind of hard to understand, you know, that the funding is clearly there. And so I guess when I just look at that very simple arithmetic, it's not calculus, it's not trigonometry, it's just $4 million for an engine and $230 billion that you are going to invest otherwise. And, you know, what percentage of that could be dedicated, you know, to this new mission? So, Mr. Rosen, again, why doesn't the railway industry want to make this transition? What's their problem?
Well, and I will add another piece of simple math I've just done in my head while sitting here, having heard earlier that the lifespan of a locomotive is up to 40 years. That means 2.5% of the fleet has to be replaced every year. There's, excuse me, been 8 years since the new standard.
Good point.
8 years times 2.5 is 20% right there.
Right there.
And what they've been doing is upgrading very old locomotives, which allow them to keep them at much lower standards, as you heard Ms. Torres explain, rather than moving to the newer ones. And it's a simple reason, it's greed. It's a little cheaper, at least in the short run, at least in what they can show on their quarterly statements, than buying the new locomotives, which will actually make a real difference in people's lives in this country, and will for a long time to come.
Yeah, so according to I don't even call it math, it's just arithmetic. You know, the industry makes about $20 million a day in net profit, $20 million a day. So if you just took one day's, that's 5 new trains, 5 new electric engines. Take 2 days, you know, you get 10. That's not, is that asking for too much out of the profit of an industry that they move in that direction? But what you're saying is it's not kind of benign neglect that Senator Moynihan used to talk about here when he was in the Senate. This is more designed neglect, right? They actually have a plan not to do this, you know, not to upgrade, even though the technology is there, even though the rest of the world is moving rapidly, you know, technologically in all fronts, but the railway industry is stuck back in this ancient era. And I love the sounds of the trains, you know, from my youth, but I can't believe that those same trains are still running on the tracks, and that every, you know, like 2.5% a year have to get replaced, and they're saying, we're not going to replace them. So again, you just come back, I guess it's their profit motive. Is that all it is, Mr. Rosen?
I believe the railroads are in business to make profit, not to move transport. They move transport in order to make profit. And this is a fundamental issue. It is the way our economy is structured. If we're going to have an economy structured that way, the government has to intercede in order to make sure they do what's needed by the greater society, because they are not structured to worry about the society.
Yeah, and the society, of course, does suffer. Okay, we know that there are higher asthmas, cancers, the closer you are to anything that's emitting these greenhouse gases. So a fact sheet published by the Association of American Railroads states that the cost of converting half of the existing locomotive fleet to catenary rail would be $100 billion. But Martin Olbermann, who is the chair of the Surface Transportation Board, in a speech to the North American Rail Shippers Association in 2021, said Class I railroads have taken home an astounding $183 billion in buybacks and dividends since 2010. And that's money not spent on safety, not spent on workers, not seen as cost savings to consumers. That's just money that goes back to the shareholders. So again, Mr. Rosen, why can't that money be used to invest in electrification? And then I'll ask you, Mr. Jeffries, why can't a certain percentage of that money be used for electrification? Mr. Rosen.
We would certainly say that it not only can it be, it should be. You know, if the railroads want to maintain themselves as private profit-making businesses, then they've got to get a lot more responsible and have to stop standing in the way of what the society needs. If not, maybe we do need to look at the alternatives that have developed in many other countries where, because it's long-term investments involved, it's been decided, you know, it's going to have to be done on a national basis, and there's been nationalization of the railroads and other industries. I don't think that's what the railroads want to see, but if they don't start acting responsibly, I think it's what the people of this country are going to demand.
Yeah, and again, Mr. Jeffries, I have a nostalgia for the past but at a certain point in time, it has to be replaced with a vision for the future. And that vision has to be articulated by every American industry, knowing how serious climate change is and what the response is going to be, especially if there are non-greenhouse gas emitting engines that are available and can be manufactured. And so I guess my question to you is, that's a lot of dough, that's a lot of dividends. And so from, my perspective, why can't that money be used to invest in electrification, Mr. Jeffries?
So I'd like to go back to the beginning. It's averaged $25 billion a year in private investment. So you're right, over 10 years, $250 billion. And the result of that is the nation's highest rated infrastructure of any type. And if my colleague wants to nationalize the rail network, I would just say take a look at the American Society of Civil Engineers grades of publicly owned infrastructure, which pales in comparison to the grade it gives the nation's freight railroads. Also, 40%.
I don't want to get into a debate about nationalization. I want to get into a debate about why can't a much higher percentage of that $250 billion go over to $4 million locomotives that are all electric? Why can't that happen? Why can't the industry just say, we're going to make a commitment to doing that because we want to play our fair share
Sure thing.
in reducing the danger that greenhouse gases play, and especially the other emissions that go into the neighborhoods where the trains go by.
So 40% of long-haul freight, less than 2% of transportation-related emissions. Again, we're not saying that's good enough. There's more work to do. That's why I have railroads investing over $1 billion in new locomotive technology. That's why we are deploying and exercising battery electric out in revenue service. That's why we're putting battery electric switcher locomotives in yards. That's why we're using zero-emission cranes. Is it going to happen overnight? Absolutely not. Even if we could flip a switch, the production capacity is not there. So to suggest that there's some sort of willful negligence, I think is frankly irresponsible when you look at the environmental profile of the industry and the investments that are made compared to practically every other industry as a percentage of revenue.
Well,
I think, to be clear, I think we all have the same goals here.
I'm just saying is that every other industry is moving and they can articulate the plan, and electric has to be our future. And by the way, electric is the industry's past. So it's not like you don't know how to do this if you wanted to do it. It's just that, you're kind of stuck in neutral on this.
Every one of my railroads has emissions reductions initiatives, science-based targets initiatives, including net zero emissions within the coming decades. So the commitment is there, the effort is there.
Yeah, but the commitment to electric trains is not there, and that is the future. It will be the future of the world, and we have the workers ready to make them right now, and the engines are there, ready to be
I think we would respectfully say that it needs to be a multi-pronged approach.
Well, I get it. We don't want to take out your other prongs. We just want you to add this prong. We don't know why you're taking out the electric prong.
I think our testimony reflects that it's absolutely part of the strategy. Maybe we're not buying, the
No, you're not.
more than you would like. The production capacity's got to be there. It's got to make sense. It's got to work. It's got to move freight. We've got to be able to serve customers. We've got to be able to serve communities.
It's just a technologically retrograde industry, okay? It's not moving to the future of technology, and you're doing okay, but that's not what this era calls for. The ocean off of Miami Beach is 100 degrees right now.
We should be moving more by freight rail.
Canada is on fire. Greece is on fire. But it's been above 110 degrees in Phoenix for the last 4 weeks, and everyone else is paying attention to it. We just want the board of directors of your association to pay attention to it too and say, let's go back to the table. Let's just look at these engines. They're there. Workers are ready to go. Technology's ready to go. And we're just going to up our share of commitment to it. And you just seem to be saying, no, we're not going to. Hell no,
That's
we're not
absolutely not what I'm saying, and the commitment is there, and we should be working together on this.
The commitment to a much higher share of all electric of trains? Is that what you're saying? The commitment is there for
I'm
that?
saying, look at the investments, read my
No,
testimony.
you're not.
and-
Yeah, you're not saying that. Yeah, you're not saying. You're saying that we have a multi-pronged approach to avoid the central question of this era, which is electric. Are we moving there? Are we going to do it? And here it's no big. It's not like we're waiting for Elon Musk to show up. It's already there, ready to go. It's an existing technology. Senator from Wyoming. I apologize for going on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jeffries, can you explain to me what the current commercial readiness is of zero-emission locomotives?
So I will say we've put battery electric out into revenue service with R&D, with support of diesel locomotives, and we've been pleased with the returns on that R&D in demonstration programs. We've deployed and purchased battery electrics, waiting on those to be delivered. Some have gotten into yards. Absolutely see promise there. But wide-scale production to replace thousands of locomotives is not a capability.
So how long would it take if reasonably, based on today's current commercial readiness, how long would it take to replace all diesel locomotives with electric? How many decades would you
I would
think?
venture multiple decades. If you could flip a switch and the capability was there, yes.
Have you done a cost-benefit analysis knowing that your emissions from rail collectively are about 1.7% of all transportation-related emissions of greenhouse gases? Have you done a cost-benefit analysis for comparing rail to automobile to airlines in terms of the benefit compared to the cost of doing these kinds of conversions to electric?
Well, I opened the hearing by saying, and I think you hit the nail on the head, that 40% of long-distance freight, less than 2% of transportation emissions. You want to reduce emissions right now and move more goods by freight rail.
Yeah, yeah. Regarding California's Air Resource Board's move towards a regulation that would ban freight rail industry from operating a large portion of their locomotives in California based on its age unless the locomotive is zero emissions, how would that regulation impact the functioning of the national rail network and short line railroads?
Well, national rail network is the key. It's an interconnected national network that operates in interstate commerce, not strictly within the bounds of one state, and that's why our regulations and the rules in which we operate under are done at the federal level, and that states do not have jurisdiction to determine the fate of our industry in interstate commerce. And with that, you also need to have the capability of doing that. Back to your first question, of a conversion. If you're going to require a zero emissions locomotive right now, you've got to have the capability to produce that at scale, and that doesn't exist. We need to get there. I think we are all collectively working toward this goal. While it may not sound like it today, but again, we're proud of our environmental profile. We've got more work to do, and that's why we're committed to doing that work and making the related investments.
Do we have enough solar and wind related electricity to handle an entire fleet of locomotives that are zero emission run on electricity?
I certainly can't begin to answer that question. I know that the additional capacity required would be fairly dramatic, so.
We've learned recently that the greenhouse gases that are emitted just in order to manufacture solar energy is 3 times more than the United Nations originally thought. Do you think that that should be factored into the total emissions of greenhouse gases and the sources of them?
Well, Senator, I can only focus on my industry and our efforts to reduce emissions, and I think you're hitting at a broader question that is for folks to debate who are bigger experts than I by every stretch of the imagination. But certainly we need to be aware of the broader impacts of policy decisions and not have on blinders.
Mr. Rosen, in your written testimony, you noted that over 75% of Class 1 railroad fleet was a Tier 2 locomotive or an earlier model. With those locomotives being ineligible to operate in California soon, won't that result in a shift away from rail and to other modes? How would we get from the Long Beach port to unload goods? How would we get that to the border of California and Nevada without rail?
Well, we won't. What you'll see is that the locomotive manufacturers in this country will actually start generating locomotives again. Right now, they aren't being ordered. The facility my union represents in Erie, Pennsylvania, has a capacity without any expansion. They've done this in past years, of 1,000 locomotives a year. We're probably a little over half of the total capacity in the country right now. It's a little hard to tell because everybody else is just flat on their back because the railroads have not been ordering new locomotives. They have not been ordering Tier 4 locomotives, which is why the numbers are so low. And it's an outrage. And that could be done. They could have been doing it all these past years, as we've been discussing here. And if, when there's demand, you get supply. And the same will be true in terms of being able to move over to the, if to the extent that there's a holdup on battery locomotives because of batteries. I think, you're seeing that in a number of industries. You're also seeing huge investments going on right now, in part through programs that Congress funded, and you're going to see a tremendous expansion of capacity for producing batteries over the next couple of years.
Well, I'll tell you, being from Wyoming, I don't mind admitting that I'm getting a little resentful of California not wanting to look at industrial scale wind farms because it destroys their view shed, but they're perfectly willing to destroy the Wyoming view shed with as many industrial scale wind farms as we can get transmission lines from Wyoming to California. And it's interesting that the people who demand wind and solar energy do not want the industrial scale energy produced in their state. They want it produced in my state. And I'm getting to the point where I'm a little sick of it. But that's it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator. So one argument against strengthening rail standards is that it will push more goods to be transported by trucks. However, we are strengthening the standards for our heavy-duty vehicles at the same time. So it stands to reason that railroads shouldn't be left to lead the race to the bottom. Everyone else is increasing their standards, promulgating regulations for everybody else. California's doing that as well. And the railway industry wants to be on the side. So, Ms. Torres, the rail industry claiming that moving freight by rail is more efficient than moving freight by truck, is that going to remain true in California, especially considering the recent agreement between the state and truck manufacturers to create a path to achieve 100% zero-emission truck sales?
As of this year, it will be cleaner and healthier for communities to transport by trucks. Unfortunately, rail is falling behind on its negligence to invest in zero emissions technology that is already here. We are not against rail or the freight system. We just want to electrify to have some relief to our communities that are exposed to these carcinogenic diesels.
So you believe, Ms. Torres, that it is possible to address emissions from both heavy-duty trucks and from locomotives at the same time?
Yes, it is. It is very possible and very needed to address both of those emissions, not just looking at the greenhouse gases, but at the health aspect too of what we call air pollutants.
No, absolutely. Mr. Rosen, are the railroads buying green locomotives at a rate that is maxing out your production?
We're in the single digits when we could be producing 1,000 of Tier 4 and some mix within that of green locomotives that aren't being completely non-emitting. But again, replacing the worst that's out there right now with Tier 4 as a stopgap while we make the bigger transition is well worth doing, and they need to make up for lost time by doing that. But we could be starting to get a lot of the green locomotives out the door, and the orders aren't there.
Yes, so, Ms. Torres, could you briefly elaborate on the disproportionate health and economic burdens faced by communities near rail yards? We'll come back to you. Ms. Torres, do you?
Hello.
Yep, Ms. Torres, could you hear my question?
Yes, sorry, the hybrid world. My apologies. Yeah, these communities of color and low-income communities are the ones who deal with the diesel emissions at higher rates, both particular matter 2.5 and NOx. It's not just the diesel coming from the locomotives, but diesel coming from switchers that are as older than us in the room. The equipment that is being used in the rail intermodal facilities in the port. I know folks have mentioned that there's work to get those into low emissions, but the technology has been there for a lot of that here to be zero emissions. That could be something that eases a lot of that burden on community. Not only are we seeing those impacts, like I mentioned, there's the noise, the light, and many of you all know, living by rail lines and rails, that are still not looked into. A lot of our community grows vegetables and fruits. We don't know what is being contaminated by the diesel of the years going through their yards, if there's water pollution or soil pollution, because unfortunately, if the data is out there, we don't see it. We don't see data from the rail yards. So as of now, what is known is the air quality impacts because we have done that research. I would love to see the rail's research on all the other impacts.
Yeah, so we know it's real. You know, when I was a boy, I grew up in Ward 2 in Malden. Every city has an environmental sacrifice ward. So I grew up in that ward. I told you, trains were on one block this side, 3 blocks the other side. The Malden River was 3 blocks, and the train rode right next to the Malden River. But next to the Malden River was also the coal company, the chemical company. Every Converse All-Star was made right along the Malden River. There was always a big cloud over Ward 2 with all of the factory spewing toxics going up into the air. And when you're 10 years old and your mother says, Eddie, whatever you do, don't swim in the Malden River. It made a lot of sense when you looked at it because it was black with a pre-Jimi Hendrix purple haze over it. You know? So I knew I wasn't Tom Sawyer on the Mississippi, okay? I knew that. And I also knew that I lived in that ward, okay? Ward 3 wasn't like that. Ward 5 wasn't like that. They were nice tree-lined streets, but not Ward 2. We had a different life. Trains, polluted river, factories, and obviously the health consequences were run by people who live in Ward 2, not Ward 3, not Ward 5, Ward 7. It was right there in Ward 2. So we all know this now in retrospect, how obvious that was. You can't use a river as a dumping ground for all of this stuff. You can't use the air. You can't use the land to do it. And I guess, Mr. Jeffries, that's all we're really saying to your industry. You just got to move with the times. You just got to move with it, okay? And electric is the future. And we have to move much more substantially towards the mitigation of the harms which are run by those people who live in the environmental sacrifice zones. And that's where your trains are. That's where the diesel trucks are. And across the board, we're trying to solve that problem because we know that there are higher levels of asthma or of cancers that people suffer from. And while we know you have to have a bottom line and returns to shareholders, there's also a responsibility to deal with the consequences of the way in which you move your trains around the country. And so this is just going to be a spotlight that's going to increase in its intensity on your industry, Mr. Jeffries. That's all I want to tell you. It's not going away. Everyone else realizes the time has come, the jig is up. We got to do something here to protect those people who live in those areas. And increasingly, even in Ward 2, they now are more black, they're more brown, you know? They replaced the families that have already moved on to Ward 3 and, you know, Ward 5 and Ward 7. So that's really the challenge, these people who get left behind and suffer the consequences for it. And we just shouldn't really accept that, and we just hope your industry will go back and reevaluate this obstinate, obdurate opposition that you have and the denialism that you're bringing in terms of your goals, because there's so much more that you could do and do it in a cost-effective way. So let me turn to you, Chair Ricketts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jeffries, it was referenced about the $25 billion that the industry invests on an annual basis, or $250 billion over 10 years. Is that investment entirely in locomotives?
No, it's throughout the network, the infrastructure, equipment, and et cetera.
So what are some of the other things that you have to invest in to run a railroad?
140,000 miles of rail, ballast, ties, tunnels, bridges,
And
technology.
So you say there's other infrastructure there, like let's just take the rails. That seems like it's a pretty big job to invest in the rails to try and keep it as safe as possible, right? I mean, I know the railroads invest in additional technology to try and find defects in the rails, is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And you have to replace parts of the rails all the time, right?
Absolutely. There's core maintenance and there's CapEx expansion.
Right. And so that's a significant part of that investment we're talking about. Is that fair?
100%. We're one of the most capitally intensive industries out there.
And then same thing for the rolling stock, not just the locomotives, but you have to have the cars that go along with it. Is that right?
Certainly, absolutely.
And you're investing in new technology to try and make those safer all the time, again, looking for defects
Absolutely.
in wheels and things like that. And that all costs money as well. That's part of that investment, is that right?
Of course, yes, absolutely.
So it's not just into locomotives that you're investing in, is that, so that's fair. So it's just part of the overall mix of all the things that take.
Part of the portfolio, absolutely.
And so when you're also talking, we also talked about the investment returns going on here. Just, do you happen to know off the top of your head, how much are, we're talking about all the, we got publicly traded companies, Union Pacific, BNSF. How much of that stock is in the hands of everyday Americans, through pension plans and 401ks and stuff like that? Do you know?
I would venture the vast majority.
Right, so when we're talking about you're providing shareholder returns, that's actually helping middle-income Americans retire, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, so that's part of when we're talking about this, and Mr. Rosen, when you're talking about nationalizing the railroads, I would just look to the example of Amtrak. I don't think that's a very successful standard, or you can look at bigger scales like the Soviet Union. I don't think that's necessarily a solution, getting back to Mr. Jeffries' point about the quality of the infrastructure there. Mr. Jeffries, also when we're talking about like this battery technology, to your knowledge, has anybody done the estimate of how much we will need to have, how many batteries we'll need to have if we were going to totally electrify, use all battery electric?
I have not seen that.
So nobody's looked to see how much lithium, cobalt, graphite, anything like that?
I would say it's a substantial amount.
There'd be a substantial amount. And do you know where those things are primarily mined and processed?
Well, I know a lot of it comes from countries that may or may not have our best interests at heart.
Yeah, absolutely. The People's Republic of China specifically, I believe the number is, has about, for example, lithium processes about 50% of it, or has about 50% of it, mines 50% and processes about 60%. And I know that other rare earth elements, it's an even higher percentage than that. And that would make us dependent on our chief adversary in the world. We spent a lot of research and time and so forth with the shale revolution that made us not dependent on OPEC, and now we're talking about making us dependent on our chief adversary in the world, which we know is trying to replace us as the global power by 2049. Xi Jinping has said that. I think we ought to take him seriously on it. So now we're talking about national security issues around if we're going to make ourselves more dependent. Wouldn't it to you seem reasonable that if people were to demand that we go to batteries, that we actually have, I don't know, say some sort of inventory of where these rare earth elements are? Do you know, has anybody done that sort of thing?
I don't, but I absolutely agree. And look, I support battery electric, let's be clear, but I also support opportunities to make sure we're acquiring necessary minerals and feedstocks from allies, if not domestically. We've got the strongest environmental laws of any country. We've got the safest worker protection laws of any country in the globe. And I don't understand why we wouldn't embrace the opportunity to get those resources from home or from allied countries or friendly countries.
Yeah, and I just had a meeting today with the Clean Freight Coalition, which actually had many of your competitors / partners in it, talking about some of these standards. And one of the things that they relayed to me was that California actually has the oldest trucking fleet in the nation because of the standards that they are doing. So you may say that all the new trucks are going to be sold are going to be zero emission or whatever, but what that, at least in California in the trucking industry, is demonstrated, according to the Clean Freight folks that I was talking to today, that they actually, then they don't buy the new ones, they actually keep the older ones running around because maybe for some of the reasons you talked about, you just can't buy enough of them. I know that talking to some of the other trucking companies that it's not feasible right now to run long-haul trucks across the road using battery because there just isn't the ability to do the charging on it. So I think, again, your concerns are well-founded, that we think about how is this all going to happen, and if we do want to have a bigger overall plan to address these things, whether it's going to be through electrification or battery electric or whatever it's going to be, somebody actually has to think about this to say how feasible is this over what period of time before we drive regulations that are going to have unintended consequences, such as maybe what we're seeing here in California with the trucking industry. So with that, Chairman Markey, I yield back.
Beautiful. So we're going to conclude the hearing, and we're going to give each one of our witnesses 1 minute to tell us what you want us to remember about your testimony here today. Then I'll turn to the ranking member for his concluding statement, and I will make mine. So we'll begin with you, Mr. Jeffries. We'll begin in reverse order of the opening.
This is a new one for me at the end of a hearing, getting to talk. I think contrary to what an observer of this hearing might think from today, I absolutely think we have the same goals. We're all want the same outcomes here, and I think it's a matter of how we get there and the paths by which we take. And certainly I'm proud of our environmental profile. I'll say it one more time, for 40% of long-haul freight, less than 2% of transportation-related emissions. Work continues to drive that down, including other types of emissions as well. And we can debate, and we have debated, whether or not our approach is the most desirable approach amongst all stakeholders. But we feel strongly about where we're going. We've made strong commitments, and we're going to live up to those commitments and continue to make the investments necessary to meet those commitments. And at the end of the day, it's all about making sure we can serve the customers and communities that we operate and we support. And we're going to continue to work to do that. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Mr. Rosen, you have 1 minute.
Thank you very much, and thank you for holding this hearing today. I think it's been very, very useful for the American people. I would say there's a point of agreement here that all modes do need to be cleaned up, but trucks are being cleaned up. There are new regulations coming for heavy trucks, et cetera, and we need to have this for rail also. I also would agree we want to move more off of the roads and onto rail. Absolutely, both passenger and freight needs to be done, but it needs to be done with an understanding that the rails are going to be as clean as possible. So, we just don't see that that's going to happen, given the structure of the rail industry, without federal and state governments taking steps to ensure that it happens. And so we're in favor of the EPA allowing states to set higher standards. But we'd really love to see the EPA set higher standards at the federal level, and we'd love to see Congress take action on this overall and to assist in making sure this happens. And lastly, I'll say I'm apparently a lot more optimistic as somebody who has actually spent my life around manufacturing in the know-how of American companies to build the things that need to be built, because I've heard a lot of excuses here as to why things just can't get done. We've got good old American know-how. Everything that needs to be done has already been shown it can be done or will be in production very shortly. And we should be looking ahead and making sure those get into place.
Beautiful. And Ms. Torres, you have the final word.
Thank you all for today. I hope we are committed to working together as Congress, as community members, as the Class 1 rails, as workers, to move EPA towards the Tier 5 emission standards all across the nation. We heard it by several folks that it can't just be a state entity doing it, but I would also urge for EPA and for Congress to urge EPA to allow our presumption in California and to follow that for the rest of our communities in the network and across the 13 million that are working and living, dealing with cancer risks, up to 22 years of their life being taken out because we continue to run, again, tier 0, 1, and 2 rail in this country. We are not against the rail or the freight system. We are made from that system. We just want to be alive to keep sustaining that system in a more cleaner and electric way. It is the future. We can't allow for owning trucks and other modes a system to move towards electric and zero emission. We need our rail systems who have hardly any regulations to move into that direction. Our communities' lives should not be put into a price. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Therese. Thank you to all of our witnesses. So I'll turn to Senator Ricketts for a closing statement.
Great. Well, hey, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman Markey, for holding this important hearing to talk about what the rail industry is doing with regard to innovation and reducing emissions. I do think it's important that as we think about the regulations, that we don't do things that are going to have unintended consequences. And while I am very confident in American know-how and ingenuity, we have to be able to plan. The reason we are successful is because we plan to be successful, not because we throw out things and see if it can happen. In fact, specifically when we're talking about, you talk about the heavy trucks, again, in my conversations with Michael Regan at the EPA and Joseph Goffman, there has not been done any planning to figure out how we're going to address some of the issues, like two 8,000-pound batteries in a truck that is hauling freight, which cuts its freight capacity in half, which means then you need to have twice as many trucks and twice as many truck drivers when we have a shortage of truck drivers as it is. So I think there's issues that we have to think through and be reasonable about what kind of time frame we can actually expect. And I think that's one of the things we found for the rail industry here today is that while we all broadly have the same goal of reducing emissions, how we go about it and what kind of regulations are put in place to do that will have unintended consequences that could have adverse effects, and they need to be thought through and planned out. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
I thank you, Senator. And I'm just going to follow up for a second on what Mr. Rosen commented upon earlier. This is a very, very profitable industry. Very profitable. Rail has a 41% operating margin. 41% operating margin. Incredible. $7 billion in net profits per year. Great business to be in 2023. And it costs $4 million per new electric train. So a profit is really only what you have after you've already made all your necessary expenditures. Then what's left over is your profit. So if you decide to not invest in non-polluting electric trains, if you decide to just stick with those trains that are polluting, that's a decision. And therefore your profits are higher. On the other hand, if instead of $7 billion a year, incredibly profitable industry, the industry only made $6 billion a year, but took $1 billion, put it into electric trains every year, that would be 250 new engines every year. 2,500 over 10 years. Just $1 billion less in profits a year. And then the industry would be saying, well, you know, that is the cost of doing business. Then we take our profits after that. And so it's a conscious decision which the industry has to make. I understand that there's going to be decisions that are made to just totally, let's max out in terms of our own financial benefit. We who are, you know, the owners of the company, we who are, you know, running the company, we who are the principal beneficiaries of the wealth that's created by the company. But there are other responsibilities as well. And a responsible industry would say, yes, we know. We have to do something about this. We are part of the community as well. And we can still get incredibly rich and reduce the harm that's caused to other people who live nearby. So I'm a technological optimist. I believe we can do this. I believe that it's all there for America to be the lead. I believe in American innovation. I believe in American ingenuity. And I believe in the American workers. I believe they can get this done for us. And so I just think that today we not only illustrated the problem, but illuminated the path forward. And we need to modernize our emission standards for locomotives to clean up our air, to protect the health of rail workers and communities, and to revitalize American manufacturing and good union jobs. And I ask unanimous consent to enter into record additional materials submitted by our witnesses and stakeholders and other senators that relate to today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. And for any senators who wish to ask additional questions, for the record, you will have 10 business days until August 9th, 2023 at 5 p.m. In order to insert those questions. And then we would ask our witnesses to, in a timely fashion, return the answers to those questions to the committee. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.